Okay, well, welcome everybody again, and welcome to Dr. Andrew Barron from the University of Central Lancashire. Is it the School of Education at UCLan? Is that who you are part of, Andy?
I'm in education studies, but we're in humanities, global studies, languages. And it's been changed. I think we're shifting. It's going to come humanities and psychology. So,
that's interesting. Well, I'll not go into that because we're being recorded. Just to say to colleagues that so as Andrew is speaking, so the preference is not to ask questions while the speaker is speaking, but if a question does spring to mind, feel free to post it in the chat function, and either you or I can come back to it when Andy's finished speaking. Other than that, we'll open it up to question and answer, as I said, for the last 15-20 minutes. So Andy's going to be speaking to us this afternoon on lecturer stress and burnout in higher education. So without further ado, I will pass over to Andy. So over to you.
Right, cheers, Craig. So this is my presentation. I'm trying to do an overview of my PhD, because this was my topic for the PhD I did, which I completed last summer 2022. So my kind of educational background is I've been working in education for nearly 25 years. Started off in FE. I was there about 8 years. Then I moved on to kind of sixth form, about 6 years there, and then I've been in higher education about a decade at UCLan. So all the time I've been in education, I've been acutely aware of stress around, with lots and lots of colleagues who always talked about feeling stressed, and seeing people go on sick leave because they were experiencing that experience of stress and burnout. And also on a personal level, I've had kind of episodes where it's got too much working. And I can remember the first couple of years working in further education was just like hell. And it was a nightmare, and it felt overwhelming. The workload was just immense. And I can remember working, say, 50 hours a week, 55 hours, even more sometimes, and it was like weekday nights you're having to working at the weekend, like at least one day, if not going into 2 days. And I can remember thinking, I can't sustain this. So those kind of first 2 years, I thought, if I don't change things, I'll just not have a job, a career in education. So I can remember that was a major kind of stress time, and managed to get through it, but it was really, really difficult. And another major time of stress was, again, early days of further education, and it was the first Ofsted inspection. And it was like the year build up to it, because we had like mock inspections and stuff like that. And it was just hell, and it was like when the inspection was done, it was just massive relief. And I can remember coming home after I'd had an observation, and just like I was driving back home and just crying at the absolute relief. And that was just that build-up of like pressure and stress. And also I can remember another time about 12 years ago, I'd had a major operation, and I'd had 6 months off. And this was like a back injury. And then going back to work, I had like 6 months off, and then went back to work because they had to, really, financially. And I wasn't really ready to go back. And it was really because I was still fairly fragile, even though I recovered a lot. Going back into a very fast-paced and demanding environment was really too much. And I can remember doing about 1 or 2 months and then not being able to cope. And then I actually went on sick leave due to kind of stress. So they're just some of the example personal experiences of stress. Now, coming round to do this kind of topic for my PhD, I can remember thinking, when I first working in higher education, and I wanted to get out of the college sector to go into higher education, and I can remember people talking about stress all the time. And there was one colleague who went off on like long-term sick leave, and that kind of was the genesis of me kind of thinking about a topic such as this to kind of do some research on, you know. And I'd had like 15 years prior of a very stressed environment with like the college sector. So that's what I kind of did. And my background is kind of sociology. And for me, it was like locating stress was just, for me, was like working in a neoliberal work environment. That for me, I just saw that as this is what are the causes of stress. So I was like, you know, kind of thinking about that. And then, you know, I don't know, it just came across C. Wright-Mills with the private troubles, the public issues kind of maxim there. And it just seems so appropriate to apply to kind of stress, because stress is obviously a private, personal thing that you experience, but it's got like there's causes of it that are often in our environment. So it was basically like that statement, private troubles, public issues, it just seemed perfect. So I kind of, that's where I kind of picked up. And for me, I had this kind of right from day one, the assumption that you've got to look at stress in the context of a neoliberal organizational culture. So you kind of looking, you know, you've got to look at like the macro picture of, and the meso and the micro. It's looking at these different levels of like understanding where environments are kind of the kind of causes of stress. So with Mills, one of the key things he's talking about is like, let's just go beyond individualizing something and like look at it in like the wider context, you know, in the society. And that was so important for him. And there were lots of different issues that he kind of brought up, which I'll maybe go into some of them later on. So when I was doing like initial research on stress, it was quite interesting looking at the studies, and most of the studies are done by psychologists. And I just kept coming across how psychologists seem to individualize the issue. They didn't really link it to organizational cultures of work environments, and they didn't link it to, say, like policies that have been created that shape an environment, a work culture. And if they're not looking at policy, they're not looking at like the ideology that informs policy. So that was something very startling that I was finding when I was looking at these specific studies on kind of stress from, you know, from this kind of psychological studies. So for me, it was like, probably we need to be multidisciplinary about this when we're looking at stress and looking at, you know, and therefore it was like, let's bring in the discipline of sociology to kind of complement, you know, a discipline such as psychology. So I was basically, you know, my study was like, I'm looking at the impact of workplace stress and burnout on lecturers and academics in UK universities. So I wanted to see the extent of stress, and that was going to be involving looking at the secondary data studies, because the beauty of the psychology studies on one level is that it's quantitative data, and they've done like surveys, so they're brilliant for kind of gauging the extent of stress. You know, they give us the percentage rates, which is so important because you find out the patterns. But one of the kind of deficiencies in a lot of the research is there is a lack of qualitative research study, which I was, you know, planning to do. So there was that level. And then also I was going to be looking at stress management interventions as well, which they, you know, referred to as SMIs. And I'll talk more about them later on. So that was the kind of areas that my study was kind of, you know, going to be looking at. Right, so I'm kind of emphasizing how we should be using the discipline of sociology to kind of enrich the study of stress in this particular context, higher education. And for me, it was so important to like look at the beyond just the individual and like try and fit it to that kind of wider organizational culture, and like, you know, possibly linking it to kind of government policy and ideology about what kind of creates the organizational culture. So for me, it was like, you know, we've got to look at, we live, we work in this neoliberal atmosphere that's informed by a neoliberal ideology, you know, and it's rampant within all sectors of education. And we know it's strong in the UK higher education system. So for me, it was like, to understand stress better and improve what psychology has given us, let's locate it into that wider context. And so I'm really wanting to emphasize the importance of sociology and just challenge the kind of orthodoxy of what psychology is talking about, because it just individualizes it to, you know, far too much. Now, I'll just throw you one study that's really very, very insightful. It was done about 10 years ago. Two researchers, Shin and Jung, in 2013, and they looked at 19 different countries, their higher education systems, and they were looking at job satisfaction and they were looking at stress, and they basically they kind of generated loads of quantitative data via surveys, and they basically found the country with the lowest job satisfaction in higher education was the UK. The country that had the highest stress levels in higher education was the UK. And that was, you know, this is 19 countries. And it was like, you know, quite very revealing. Some people will be saying, I'm not surprised at that. But it was good how they pushed the idea that they found that the countries that had the highest stress levels, and the UK being the top, they were based on like kind of market orientated higher education systems. Whereas the countries that had lower stress levels and higher levels of job satisfaction, they were not, they'd not really kind of gone down the road of the marketization of education. So that was a really compelling study that I came up, and I just thought this is kind of proving, you know, like reinforcing my kind of initial ideas. So we've got a quote here. The Sociological Imagination, which is from C. Wright-Mills, it's not, this quote isn't actually by him. This is a guy called Trevino who's written lots of books on C. Wright-Mills, and it's just a really nice quote that kind of captures C. Wright-Mills's idea of the sociological imagination. And you know, you can probably see it for yourself, but I'll just pick out one particular part of the sentence just towards the end. I think where it says individuals must be aware that the malaise and frustrations they experience in their inner lives are linked to the big picture of society, to those problems residing at the level of structure. So it's that nice link between the individual to the wider picture, and it's, you know, talking about structure, which is really important for me when I've been doing this research. Right, so I've come at this using sociological theory, and I'm using kind of neo-Marxist critical theory. And as I mentioned, I've talked about C. Wright-Mills, and I also used Habermas. So C. Wright-Mills, he wrote this book, Sociological Imagination, 1959. And he, you know, he was saying there's lots of different aspects of life that it's so important to look at the wider picture. And he gives a couple of examples like unemployment and divorce. So these can be very private problems, issues for individuals, and they might blame themselves, you know, I can't get a job, or why is my marriage failing and I'm getting divorced? And people can individualize it and then turn it on themselves. And Mills were like basically saying it could be the individual's fault, but it might not be. It could be the society that you live in. So, for example, unemployment. If you live in a country, you live in a city where there's mass unemployment, it's really not your fault that you're unemployed. But if there is a situation where there is full employment and you still can't get a job, you know, it might be down to the individual. So it gives examples like that. And I just thought this is excellent to kind of apply to the issue of stress, considering, you know, the data shows how stress levels are high, they're very extensive, and therefore, you know, it's like a place to kind of locate the kind of stress, the stress research. Also, I used Habermas as well. And one of the reasons I came across using Habermas, I was looking at, I came across an article in the Sociology Journal, and there was somebody who did a study of the teaching union, the National Education Union, NUT going back, and they used Habermas to describe how union members who were teachers felt like that their world of education and scholarship and learning was being smothered, it was being saturated by corporate values. And this particular study used Habermas to kind of say how that kind of economic, monetarized, commodified system is colonizing that world of education. And this study on the union talked about union members as teachers feeling that in the classroom, but they also felt like that in their union work as well, and the chance to kind of speak educational issues about the job and how they were facing this onslaught of this like corporate monster in there. So I can remember thinking about that particular article, and I thought, right, it's excellent to kind of apply to the issue of stress and that kind of the economic, commodified, marketized education system creates a toxic environment, and people can't cope with it. It's too demanding. They get stressed out, and you know it's that colonization of our educational life world that, you know, we celebrate, engage in, like knowledge, research, teaching, you know, exchanging ideas, etc., etc. So that's where I was like, the theoretical base kind of came into, you know, try and understand the kind of context we're working and like helping us to understand what's going on. So the methodology, like I was doing primary research, qualitative data, semi-structured interviews. I had a small sample. It was 12 participants, and I used a method called interpretive phenomenological analysis. And it's kind of used in health contexts and education. So this was excellent for me because my studies are a mixture of both. And just very briefly about this. I did like this approach because it's a very much a hands-on type of method, and your analysis of the data is also, it's very manual as well. And it was literally, you know, transcribing all the data, all the recordings, and then kind of going through on a very manual, practical basis of like finding out themes, you know, doing the kind of descriptions, doing the interpretations going on. So I found it quite useful as a tool, and I did like it when on the kind of the double hermeneutics on how we analyze the meanings of it. So one, it's stressing be empathic to the world of the participant, and then the other one is about it gives you license to interpret the reality and the experiences. So you can bring in your own creative interpretation and go beyond the empathic part that you've done with the participant. And the kind of the particular writers that have kind of built this approach, they're like kind of encouraging that, and they kind of made reference, you can use like bigger meta-narratives of discourse analysis or critical theory. So for me, it was like usually with any kind of interpretive kind of methodology, I always feel it misses out the bigger picture. So I wanted to bring in critical theory that's got the final hermeneutics, the triple. And that always like says, right, we need to look at like the environment in which meanings are generated, that wider context. Because if you don't, you're missing out on a vital ingredient. So that was just excellent for that. And part of the critical theory approach, what Habermas calls the emancipatory interest, is that research, the aim is to kind of change things. Obviously we've got to understand what's going on, but we've got to like use that information to change things for the better. And obviously a health problem such as stress, we need to be thinking along those lines. So this, that was a kind of methodological part. So we've got the definition here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The definitions of stress and burnout. And basically, I paraphrase that definition of stress is about the demands upon you are too much and you do not have the resources to meet those demands. And you then go under and you can't function. It might create states such as anxiety or depression. You might end up having to take time off work. You might leave a job because you can't meet the demands of the situation. And it can come in different forms, those demands. Workload is excessive workloads where you don't have the physical time to meet all the different tasks that are fired at you. Or it could be the actual targets that are set from management or from governments or whatever are impossible to fulfill, especially the kind of league table culture that we exist in. Or, the emotional demands that we face from, say, the student body is too much. And, there's a lot of literature about emotional labor in that. So that's the kind of a really nice definition of stress. Burnout, there's one writer here talks about it's chronic stress. And then you've got Malash and Jackson. They've talked about burnout and done a lot of research, and they give, these kind of different component parts of burnout, which is basically the emotional exhaustion, and then you feel you can't cope, and then you detach yourself from, in our context, whether it's colleagues, whether it's students, because you can't cope, and also you feel like you're not competent enough because you kind of the demands are too much, you're exhausted, your efficacy is like is kind of been damaged. So that's the kind of working definitions that I've got there. Right, just some just have a look at time. Right, yeah, just some secondary research studies, and generally research has been going on in the kind of stress in higher education, probably the mid-90s, and there's been quite a lot of studies produced. There's a writer called Gail Kimman. She's actually a psychologist, but she's done lots and lots of really, really good research on stress. And she is quite a progressive psychologist because she does kind of talk about the wider environment, and she's kind of has linked things to policy. And the trade union UCU in higher education, whenever they're doing any stress surveys, they always commission Gail Kimman to actually do the research. But as you can see down there, there's lots of factors that they've constantly been talking about that cause workplace stress. And they found that the patterns have been increasing throughout the years. And they've always been high anyway, but they are kind of on the increase. And you've got like in all those different factors down there, you can probably trace it to the work environment or conditions of employment, and also people as well, like management and students, are in there with like being major kind of stressors. just give you one figure. Just in going back to that previous slide, one of the studies there was done a couple of years ago, and they did an extensive survey, and they said that they found that 53% of their survey, and it was a survey that included thousands of HE lecturers and academics, they found that 53% had probable clinical symptoms of depression. So you can see the figures are, they are very significant. They're very, very high. Right, this next part that I want to look at is stress management interventions. And this is basically like how organizations prevent and treat stress. And also researchers, they will make recommendations of how we should deal with stress. So Cooper talks about there's 3 different types of interventions. So the first one is primary, and this is things at the structural level. So this is like looking at the wider organizational culture and practices. So this could include things like workload. It could include things like about job contracts and job security. You could kind of create policies where you don't have casualized hourly paid jobs, fixed term jobs, etc. It also could referring to like management styles and practices as well. So it's that wider, big scale structural issue. And you change those things to kind of try and prevent stress in the first place. Now, the secondary stress management intervention is the individualized prevention intervention. So organizations, universities might say to the staff, we will equip you to make you stronger and more resistant to being a victim of stress. So we will like encourage you to go on like stress management training courses, go on resilience programs, things, do mindfulness, meditation, do all these kinds of things, and you'll be in a better position to be able to cope with stress. So it's like the idea is equipping, empowering the individual to kind of be able to deal with the environment. And the final one, tertiary stress management interventions, is after the events happened of being stressed out and being probably ill with it, what an organization can do to help you. And that'll be something like, receive counseling or go to occupational health or go to your GP and get medication, that type of thing. Unfortunately, a lot of psychology research, when they are making recommendations, they ignore the first one, primary, and they just seem to emphasize secondary and tertiary. And if you look, you probably go to any HR, personnel, people team, resource area, and they again will be emphasizing secondary and tertiary stress management interventions. They don't really want to know about the primary. So for me, it was like, we've got to really take this on board, deal with the primary. Right, so just getting to conscious at time, I just want to go on to some of the data that I came out with. And basically, from my, data analysis, using the interpretive phenomenological analysis approach, I kind of found 2 areas which the participants kept talking about. And the first area that I've kind of put in is to do with like the work environment conditions. And these were some of the big themes that came out. People were talking about workloads, excessive workloads in detail, and they give lots of really good examples to illustrate that. They also talked about job insecurity with like the hourly paid type of contract. And, lots of them were talking about how they'd been on that contract for years and they lived in perpetual job insecurity because every year they didn't know if they had a job. So that was like a massive stressor. Unrealistic work targets. And a lot of people talked about trying to mix in teaching and research and finding it really, really difficult. Also, I found out with some of the participants how they'd had external issues, problems. You know, they might have had ill health, or they might have had a family member who was ill, and it caused them quite a bit of stress. But when they went back to work, it was how the work organisation was not sensitive and sympathetic to what they'd experienced outside at home, in the home environment. And people talked about that as a stressor, the lack of support from work. The other big area that I found was which I've termed people stressors. And basically it was like management was like cited, the consumer student, and also colleagues that, you know, were basically in a very competitive, uncollegiate type of manner. Also, I found out amongst most of the females, they highlighted the issue of like everyday sexism in the work environment, and they were talking about that as a stressor. And none of the males that kind of mentioned that issue of sexism, but most of the females did. So that was, you know, the kind of a stressor. So I was basically, I was like arguing that if you look at all these different factors, it is about the kind of organizational culture that we work within. And, you know, you can trace this a lot due to neoliberal policy and ideology. So I'll just give you some examples of quotes from people from the data. So this first one, a couple of participants, casualisation. And the first one is basically like he'd been on an hourly paid contract for 7 years, and he talked about basically being in poverty, and you know how insecure he was about it. And this particular guy, for him, it was really important having a breadwinner role in his relationship, in his marriage. And these 7 years in which it was only hourly paid, you know, besides the poverty and the low status at work, it affected his kind of identity as a male and in, you know, his relationship, his marriage. The next person down there, M1, this particular person was on an hourly paid contract for 3 years. Fortunately, he eventually, with kind of union intervention, he got a permanent contract. But whilst he was on this hourly paid contract, what was happening was that you know, he didn't know whether he was going to have secure work when he went back after the summer. So what he had to do, he had to supplement his hourly paid contract with 2 other jobs. So he did a little bit of freelance music journalism, and he had a job working in HMV. So he was working in HMV for like 25 hours a week, and he was doing loads and loads of teaching hours. And he told me one particular tale where he was working at HMV, and a student came into the shop and bought something and seen him behind the counter. And this student was like baffled why the lecturer was like working as a shop assistant in HMV, because they'd just seen him the previous week do a lecture. And he talked about, this participant talked about the demoralization, about what was his identity. You know, was he actually a teacher, a lecturer? So there was poverty and insecurity there, but it brought about like identity issues as well. There's a quote there from P4 about workload. And she was talking about one week she like worked 70 hours in one particular week. She didn't work that every week, because she would have like been destroyed if she did, but she always talked about working more than like the 37 hours. You know, she said she was doing like 45, 50 hours at least every week, and some weeks it went higher than that. And she just talked about exhaustion. And I can remember one time she said that she'd had a really, really busy week. She'd been working all weekend. And then on the Monday, she was working, but she was working from home. And she said she was that tired in the afternoon, she couldn't physically do any work, so she just went to bed and had a sleep the whole afternoon because it kind of caught up with her. So she talks about that, and in this excerpt there, she talks about how she wanted in her appraisal to be that recognition, and she kind of like talks about how the kind of appraiser didn't like recognize that. The next one down there, L3, who talks about students as being a stressor and in relation to the kind of emotional demands that students can bring to you. And she kind of talks about, students coming to her about unwanted pregnancies, about date rape. And, she talks about it, how kind of exhausting that was. The next one I'm looking at, again, this comes under the people stressors, and this is like the managerialism and management. And this is a really an interesting quote. And this particular participant was a very, very experienced lecturer, an academic. She was probably in her kind of her 60s. And so she's kind of seen how things have changed and how management have become more harsh and more punitive. And she talks about in the past how kind of line managers were a little bit more people friendly, a bit more humane, and weren't, like be encouraging you to make sure you have a break at the weekend. And then she's like said how it's changed in a negative way over the years. And she's saying how things have become more, management have become more distant, they've become more punitive, more bureaucratic. There's a blame culture there. So it's interesting how a very experienced academic lecturer can see the changes in the management style, how it's become, even more punitive. Right, and so final area just of some of the primary data, just on some of the issues to do with stress management intervention. So I got lots of responses on this, but just two quotes here from two participants, and both of them were saying how the experiences of being on the hourly paid, casualised, precarious type of contract causing lots of anxiety, lots of insecurity, lots of stress, led them to seeking support from their GP. And both of them basically ended up being on like medication, like kind of antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs. And also both of them also kind of ended up using counselling as well to cope with the circumstances at work. So these are the kind of serious kind of repercussions of experiencing stress, where you're driven to getting counselling and therapy or actually needing medication to cope with your actual job. Right, just conscious of the time. Yeah, I'll just quickly very much finish because probably need a bit of time for discussion. So one of the things I did find really interesting, and I suppose it was a bit of a surprise really, was they told me all the dark side and the stress and the pain and etc., but they kept talking about how they liked the job and they got job satisfaction and they prized their employment, they prized their role. The people talked about they love teaching and they like their relationship with students, and they like to see the development of academic progress with the students. They talked about the kind of the creativity and the inspiration that they got from like doing research. And so I kept hearing, all this kind of enthusiasm and positivity about the job, and this determination and this resilience coming through. And for me, it was like I could hear very much so they saw the job as like a kind of vocation. And, they were like celebrating the important things within that educational life world about learning and scholarship, etc. So it made me kind of wanting to kind of give a term for this, and I called this like critical life world resilience, because they wanted to, you know, they'd shown they are resilient because they survive, and it's like they love the job, but they hate the work environment. So that's why I was like wanting to give that term that I kind of phrased. And I was quite surprised at the level of the positivity about working. You know, they did tell me all the dark stories and you know, and they were really, really clear about that. But they also talked about this kind of positive side and the light. So, you know, that was, you know, a very interesting kind of thing. So yeah, the final thing for you know, for this presentation is, you know, for me it's like it's a public health issue, stress, you know, in the context of higher education and in other work kind of environments. We need to use a multidisciplinary approach, use different academics, subjects, disciplines to understand stress, you know, sociology, psychology, politics, policy, you know, and we need this kind of comprehensive analysis on it. And I think we've got to look at structural factors, and we've got to look at that relationship of like ideology, policy, and how that informs a workplace environment and culture, and the impact that has on stress. Because if we don't, we're not going to change things, and it'll just be, you know, 10 years time, someone else will just be saying the same kinds of things, you know, when they're doing research. So that's it. So thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy. Wow, yeah, very comprehensive. Oh, can we just mute our microphones to stop the yeah, I think that's done it. Yeah, excellent. Very comprehensive and really insightful as well. So provokes quite a number of questions for me to ask and address. But I don't like sort of abusing my chair's position, so I'd like to open it up to other colleagues first. So I'll just check, click into the chat, see if there's anything in there. Not yet. So that must mean that we have colleagues that want to actually ask you questions. So who wants to go first? Any question? You can either, you know, show of hands or wave a hand, or just unceremoniously jump in.
Can I do the unceremonious approach, please, Craig? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, fire away, yeah.
So I'm on my phone. I've had to come away from the building. I'm on my phone, so it's difficult. I'm walking along. I'm trying to catch a train. I just wanted to ask, I enjoyed the talk, first of all, and the presentation, so thank you. I just want to ask, what do you think, personally and academically as a researcher, are the prospects in terms of challenging what you call the colonisation of the life world of, you know, of lecturers, higher education lecturers, which is your main emphasis, but also you did refer to college-based higher education as well. I just wanted to sort of, what your reflections in terms of the prospects. You concluded, didn't you, talking about the future, how it'd be sort of nice if people didn't have to actually conduct this research in the future into these negative effects of neoliberalisation. So what do you think the prospects are, basically, for the future?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult situation, and I don't, you know, see that it's going to be easy to change what, you know, and I think ultimately we've got to change the root source, and it's basically, you know, we need to get rid of like the values, the ideology of neoliberalism within education. So that's like big structural issues. I think from maybe a more a kind of smaller level is that you need to generate awareness about stress, and hopefully that has increased in the workplace. But I think, and you see it, you know, as part of mental health kind of initiatives going on, and stress will come into that. But there's the danger, the real danger of they're just you've got like the secondary, tertiary interventions where they just individualize it and they ignore the actual wider structural things. And you know,
I'd agree. Yeah. So I would agree that it tends to become neoliberal versions, like the neoliberal self, isn't it? Neoliberal individual. So when you get things like assertiveness training and things like mindfulness, institutional mindfulness, which is often, I think it's a third generation of that, which is sort of CBT plus mindfulness. That's very popular in recent times. But they're all focused on the individual and the coping strategies for individuals, like you've said. I think that's even that there's a whole industry there, isn't there? A well-being industry, which has been colonized by neoliberalism. So they've kind of like conquered the alternatives as well to some extent.
Yeah, I think one of the hopeful things though is coming at it from a health and safety point of view, because it's a health issue, and if you can put it into that context, you can maybe start to kind of change the more structural dimensions. Because you get with, like, say, trade unions will come from that perspective. They will, like, you know, because when I've been to kind of different talks, I've been pushing this point of view, and I can remember I was attending, it was a UCU thing, and it was one of the health and safety officers. She was like right on board with like addressing the primary causes and the structural. And so you want that kind of thinking. So it's like using movements like trade unions to kind of get on that agenda of like the kind of structural stuff.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers, Dave.
Yeah, thanks for that. Any other questions?
I was wondering myself.
Go on, Joe.
Joe here. Hiya. Thanks very much, Andy. I recognised, a lot of what you were saying. I did some work a few years ago about the effects of the NSS on staff and how that played out. And of course, the TEF and the REF and all these other things. And one of the things that I've been interested in is how much we're all guilty of it, I think. We get sucked into these mechanisms, don't we, as individuals, because we are evaluated according to them. And also there's a certain sense in which it gives us a form of satisfaction for our publications to be rated in a particular way, while also wanting to decry the ref. So we live in this strange world, don't we, where we're playing both games simultaneously. And that's if we're one of the lucky people like me who's actually on a permanent contract, we do that. Let alone if you're a person who's on, it's basically the gig economy, isn't it? Meets higher education. It's a horrible situation. I wondered if you mentioned at one point a woman who you'd interviewed who was thinking back to previous times and talking about middle management and how she felt things had changed in the recent past. I wonder if you ever ended up speaking to people who have, relatively speaking, forms of power that they can exercise, who were actually within institutions trying to push back against any of these mechanisms or structures that are there controlling us, as it were, as well as, playing us. Did you ever feel that you met people who were able to talk about how it's an invidious thing, isn't it? Everything's individualized, and institutions' responses to these things are highly individualized, but at the same time it does rely, I sometimes feel we don't do as much as we ought to as individuals within institutions and push back. I don't know if you ever ended up speaking to people. I'm rambling. It's not really a question, but whether you did ever encounter people who you felt were doing that.
With that particular participant. I'm echoing it. She basically were like saying there were a sense of like frustration, and that the circumstances have become as they have, and there might have been support from immediate colleagues of like resisting all the pressures and all the unreasonableness in the environment. But she did talk about the importance of being in the union as well, and she saw that as a collective voice that would represent the staff with, you know, the values of the educational life world. And she said, you know, it's like if we didn't have the union, just imagine how bad things would be. So that was one forum of kind of sanity and kind of pushback.
Okay, thanks. So Jonathan has a hand up. So Jonathan, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Andy. Really good. Just it's slight aside to what you're talking about, but it was just that bit of the where you talked at the end about how everyone seemed to be really enjoy their work despite the stress that was there as well. Did you get any sense from those conversations you had with people as to what was it that they were enjoying so much despite the you know, the very real horror of the stress you were describing or they were describing?
I think there'd be like, if they were talking about teaching, they still seem to get satisfaction and the kicks from working with students. You know, if it was like productive and they saw the developmental journey of students learning and progressing, they got a buzz from that. And it was like as if once they went into the classroom, it was their domain, and they could like cut off from the organizational nightmare. And also, you know, doing research as well. You know, that there is, even though there's obviously pressures about research with targets and etc., but they kind of once they got involved in the research, it's like a creative process, and these kinds of things are like, that's what made them want to start a career in education. And as long as they can kind of keep those flickers going of like the passion that originally got them into something, it was the nourishment for them, and the job satisfaction, you know, in the wider backdrop of all the negativity. So that's the kind of things that they were kind of saying to me.
Okay, I'm going to ask one of my questions. Can we just? I've got terrible. Oh, that's it. Right. So I'm interested in the kind of methodology part of your research, because obviously there was some really quite almost traumatic and revealing, you know, the participants divulge a lot of detail. So I'm just wondering how did you support participants as part of that? You know, was it yeah, did you, I don't know, how did you feel about receiving such kind of revelations, and what did you do as kind of aftercare, in a sense, follow-up? Kind of, yeah, interested in that.
I mean, going back ages and ages ago, I did my counselling training, and I have got a little bit of experience of doing counselling. So I did feel fairly comfortable and confident in doing the interviews, kind of thinking, expecting I might get that type of thing, you know, like heavy information, but I thought I'd be able to handle it, and they will be able to see that I could handle it and deal with it. And all the interviews were, fortunately, they were, people did feel comfortable. There are a few people actually did say, you know what I mean, they said, oh, it's like as if I've just had like a counselling session, and it's been therapeutic, kind of offloading and airing all the grievances about it. But I was aware that, you know, at the end of it, you're kind of thinking, what is this person, how are they going to be when they're leaving you? But it was there was no signs of people feeling distressed. They were just they got into the moment of like being angry, or there were one time one person did have a little bit of a flashback to something that had happened. But you know, she kind of came out of that, and she was fine, you know. So fortunately, everything did work out okay with regard to that issue. But I was having to be aware of it, and it's something that if you are doing that area of research, you've got to kind of consider, because I come across a really good couple of articles that were talking about researchers dealing with very sensitive topic areas, and the dangers how people have like ended up, because most of my interviews were about an hour long, and this article were talking about how some researchers in their interviews, they've gone on for several hours, and it's like you shouldn't be doing that, because they were basically thinking, I can't leave this person who's like talking about stressful things or trying to rescue them and make things better. And that's why they've gone over the boundaries of the actual role, because they are just researchers, you know, and also the time boundaries as well. So it can be potentially a minefield, that kind of dealing with sensitive topic areas. But fortunately, it went, you know, it was okay.
Yeah, excellent. I can yeah, so understand and appreciate how cathartic it must have been for those people, you know, somebody to actually listen to you know, those kind of stresses. Okay, we're up to the 5 o'clock mark. So are there any kind of, you know, maybe time for one quick final question, if anybody would like to ask one? No, that's okay. There is Rachel has posted a comment in the chat, which isn't a question, it's just a kind of you know, confirmation of what you've been speaking about, and sort of her explaining that she's got a lot out of it. So
All right, excellent.
right, so I will just stop the recording there.